Denmark just quietly became the hardest country in Western Europe on radical Islam.
Hello, guys. I feel that most of this European Union are complicating issues for themselves based on the new laws against Islamic. Watch this video and tell me in the comment section what you feel about the new law of Denmark. That will help us to analyze this video in a proper way of understanding.
Not Sweden, not France, not Germany. A nation of 6 million people, smaller than the city of London, has spent a decade building walls around its own civilization. Legal walls, cultural walls, political walls. It banned the face veil. It bulldozed neighborhoods. It cut asylum approvals to a historic low. And in the spring of 2026, it took one more step that almost nobody outside its borders saw coming. To understand how a famously gentle welfare state became Europe's toughest fortress, you have to begin somewhere unexpected. For most of recent memory, Denmark was the textbook Scandinavian success story. A generous welfare state, some of the highest social trust on the planet, free education, low corruption, and an almost religious belief that the state and the citizen owed each other a fair deal. Immigration was folded into that confidence without much thought. Through the 1990s and into the early 2000s, the Danish political class largely assumed integration would take care of itself. Hand new arrivals language classes, plug them into the welfare system. Wait one generation. They would simply become Danish. That was the theory. The reality arrived slowly and then all at once. By the mid-2000s, Danish authorities were producing figures that made uncomfortable reading. Unemployment among non-Western immigrants ran several times higher than among native Danes. Only around 55% of children from non-Western backgrounds finished upper secondary education by age 25, against roughly 85% of ethnic Danes. Whole neighborhoods were forming where most residents shared neither the language nor the unspoken social codes of the country around them. Welfare dependency in certain immigrant-heavy districts sat at levels that, scaled nationally, would have bankrupted the Danish model outright. And then the public mood began to move. Surveys picked up something the elite had spent years pretending not to notice. Ordinary Danes were not turning against immigrants as people. What they feared losing was the thing that made Denmark Denmark, the high-trust, low-friction social glue that let a tiny country run one of the most expensive welfare states on Earth. You cannot fund a Nordic system without an almost instinctive belief that everyone around you plays by the same rules. The moment that belief cracks, the whole machine starts to grind. Danes felt those cracks long before their politicians would admit them. The numbers behind the anxiety are not enormous, but for Denmark, they were seismic. By 2025, figures from Statistics Denmark showed immigrants making up roughly 12.6% of the population. Add their Danish-born children, and the immigrant origin share climbs to about 16%. In Sweden, the comparable figure sits above 27%. So, on paper, Denmark looks like a modest case. But for a society that was nearly homogeneous a generation earlier, the shift felt like the ground moving. Within it, one group drew particular attention. Roughly 270,000 residents tracing their roots to Muslim-majority countries, the largest communities coming from Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and the Balkans. In a country where everyone seemed to know everyone, that was enough to change the texture of entire towns. Places like Mjolnerparken in Copenhagen, Gellerupparken in Aarhus, Voldsmoser in Odense. Dense housing estates where unemployment ran near 40%, where crime sat well above the national average, and where Danish authorities admitted in their own official documents that something resembling a parallel society was taking shape inside their borders. Police described streets where ambulance crews would not enter without escort. Teachers reported classrooms where Danish was rarely spoken. Young men from certain disadvantaged backgrounds were convicted of violent offences at roughly 2.5 times the rate of native Danes.
And there were quieter records too.
Internal Danish reports cataloguing things European discourse rarely touches. Honor-based violence, forced marriages, girls kept out of swimming lessons and school trips, informal community courts settling disputes outside Danish law. For a nation whose entire social contract rests on individual liberty under uniform rules, that patchwork did not read as diversity. It read as a second state being assembled, brick by brick, inside the first. So the political class did something almost no one else in Western Europe would do. They named it out loud. Naming the problem was the moment Denmark crossed the line the rest of Europe was still pretending didn't exist. Because once you write something into official strategy in those words, every solution that follows becomes politically thinkable. And what followed went further than almost anyone inside the country expected. In 2018, the government published a document called One Denmark Without Parallel Societies. It was not a white paper, it was a war plan. It created an official list, ranking neighborhoods by criteria: unemployment, criminal convictions, education, average income, and one threshold most European governments would never dare put into law: the share of residents from non-Western backgrounds. If that share passed 50% and the area met enough of the socio-economic markers, it was formally labeled a parallel society. Stay that way for 5 years, and it became something harsher still, a so-called transformation area. The list itself wasn't new. Denmark had published an official ghetto list since 2010, cataloguing 29 high immigrant districts as targets. What changed in 2018 was the response. Instead of pouring in more money, the government decided to physically restructure the neighborhoods. The law required public housing associations in transformation areas to cut social housing by 40% by 2030. In practice, that meant demolitions, forced sales to private developers. Long-term tenants told their leases would not be renewed. Families uprooted from estates they had lived in for decades because the buildings themselves were being torn down to break the demographic makeup of the area. Around it came a battery of sharper rules. Daycare made effectively mandatory for children from listed zones, so the state could shape language and culture from day one. Crime penalties doubled inside those zones, the same theft carrying twice the punishment on one side of a Copenhagen street as the other. Tighter welfare, stiffer citizenship rules, including a values contract new citizens have signed since 2016. Danish ministers didn't hide behind bureaucratic language. They called parallel societies a threat to Denmark itself, not a challenge to manage, but a threat to eliminate. The most famous battleground became Mjølnerparken, a 1980s estate in Copenhagen's Nordrebro district. International travel media called it one of the coolest neighborhoods in the world for its food and street culture. The Danish state called it a parallel society. Long-term residents Many naturalized citizens who had run businesses and raised children there for 30 years suddenly found themselves counted in official statistics as part of a problem the country was actively dismantling. Some were told to leave, some refused. The protests grew, and the international press took notice. By 2024, the official tally of designated parallel societies had fallen from 12 to 8. The government called that progress. The residents being evicted called it something else. The policy was aggressive enough that it climbed all the way to the European Union's highest court. In February 2025, an Advocate General at the European Court of Justice issued an opinion that the Danish scheme amounted to direct discrimination based on ethnic origin. In December 2025, the court ruled the law may breach EU anti-discrimination rules and sent the case back to Danish courts for review. In almost any other European country, a ruling like that ends the policy overnight. In Denmark, the government essentially shrugged. The responsible minister dismissed the earlier opinion as non-binding. The demolitions continued. The evictions continued. The redevelopment plans rolled on. And that was only one front. Because the question of who lives where always sits on top of a deeper one. What kind of country was Denmark actually defending? The answer ministers kept returning to was a country where two strangers passing on the street could look each other in the face. Which brings us to the veil. In May 2018, the Danish Parliament voted 75 to 30 to ban any garment covering the face in public. On paper, it named no religion. In practice, everyone understood it was about the niqab and the burqa, and Denmark was saying so years before its neighbors would even open the discussion. The Justice Minister at the time, Søren Pape Poulsen, skipped the diplomacy. Hiding the face, he said, was incompatible with Danish values and disrespectful to the community. Denmark, he said, was drawing a line in the sand. Here, people meet each other face to face. A first offence brought a fine of 1,000 Danish kroner. Repeat violations could climb to 10,000, or, in extreme cases, a short jail term. Independent estimates suggested only 150 to 200 women in the entire country actually wore the full veil. Critics called the law symbolic, performative, even cruel. Ministers didn't deny it was symbolic. That was the point. Symbols, they argued, are exactly what a society fights over when it's deciding what it will and won't accept. And the public agreed in numbers that alarmed human rights groups. A 2022 YouGov survey found around 72% of Danes backed the veil ban. A 2021 study found 66% supported the burqa law specifically, a dramatic shift from a decade earlier when the same idea would have been widely condemned. The outrage abroad was loud. Amnesty International called it a violation of women's rights. In 2019, the UN Human Rights Committee found Denmark's enforcement breached international obligations. American Muslim groups branded it a dangerous precedent. The Danish response never changed. Noted, and we're not changing course. And this wasn't Denmark's first walk into a religious freedom fight others wouldn't touch. Back in 2014, the government had effectively banned the ritual slaughter behind kosher and halal meat by requiring all animals be stunned first. Jewish and Muslim leaders called it discriminatory. The agriculture minister replied that animal welfare comes before religion, a sentence that captured the whole Danish approach. When faith collides with what Denmark defines as a secular value, the secular value wins.
Then they went after where people could pray.
From 2023, the government pushed to phase out prayer rooms in schools and universities, arguing those spaces should stay secular. Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen framed democracy and secularism as non-negotiable foundations of Danish life, warning that classroom prayer rooms risked turning schools into arenas of religious expression rather than universal learning. Christian calendars stayed untouched. Critics accused the government of singling out Muslims. The government barely argued. It pointed to public support and its majority and moved on. Some proposals went further, floating fines for institutions that refused to repurpose existing prayer spaces. At the same time, Denmark tightened the screws on foreign-funded religious institutions, pushing mosques to disclose external financing and clamping down on imams accused of preaching anti-democratic or anti-integration messages. Hate speech and radicalization laws were extended to reach preachers operating inside the country, whatever their nationality. The message to political Islam was blunt: preach in Denmark and you preach inside Danish rules.
And quietly, Denmark was closing the door itself.
The asylum system. Because if you can't enter, debates about veils and prayer rooms become hypothetical. Since 2019, Frederiksen's Social Democrats had openly committed to what they call a zero refugee policy. In 2024, Denmark received 2,333 asylum applications and granted only 860. By late November 2025, only 839 had been approved for the entire year, a figure the ministry itself called historically low. British officials calculated Denmark's policies had pushed claims to a 40-year low, with roughly 95% of rejected applicants actually removed. In January 2026, Immigration Minister Rasmus Stoklund said it plainly. It was critical that as few foreigners as possible obtain asylum in Denmark. If you're following this far, subscribe to Fall of Nations, because what happened next reshaped the whole European debate.
Here is the strangest part.
The architect of Western Europe's toughest stance on Islamic immigration was not a right-wing firebrand. It was the centre-left, the Social Democrats. Mette Frederiksen herself, the party that in almost any other European country would have been the gentle voice on migration. In Denmark, they became the hammer. They swallowed the issue whole, outflanking the right by simply taking its agenda. By 2022, the traditionally pro-immigration Danish left had gone quiet or fallen in line. The Danish People's Party, which had pushed hard migration policy from the right for decades, watched much of its program absorbed into mainstream centre-left government.
To the social democratic base, unions, working-class voters, it was never sold as an attack on Muslims. It was sold as defense of the welfare state. The internal logic ran like this: you cannot fund universal healthcare, free university, and generous pensions while running an open door to permanent settlement from regions with very different social contracts. Either the welfare state goes, or the open door goes. The Social Democrats chose the door. The result was almost unimaginable elsewhere in Western Europe, a near total consensus that Denmark would not, under any major party, return to the open door era. That consensus is why the Danish model is so hard for outsiders to dismantle. Inside the system, almost no one of weight wants to. Then came the earthquake. On March 25, 2026, Danes went to the polls, and Frederiksen, who
who had spent 6 years branding her party as Europe's toughest centre-left government on migration, was expected to coast to a third term. The Social Democrats scored 21.9%, their worst general election result since 1903. The left bloc fell short of a majority. So did the right bloc. 12 parties, no clear winner, a fractured parliament. Fredriksson tried for weeks to assemble a cross-bloc coalition. It collapsed. On May 9, 2026, King Frederick X asked Liberal leader Troels Lund Poulsen to build a centre-right government instead. In the talks that followed, the Danish People's Party offered conditional support tied to a significantly stricter immigration policy. Some of their language described the goal as reducing net immigration to the point of long-term population decline among certain immigrant groups. Not lower immigration, not stricter integration, the active, deliberate departure of Muslims from the country. Think about what that means. A centre-left prime minister adopted the hardest immigration regime in Western Europe, won 2 elections on it, neutralised her own far-right opposition by stealing their platform, and lost power anyway, to a coalition that found her stance too soft. The Overton window in Denmark didn't just shift, it cracked open in a direction Fredriksson herself probably never meant to enable. And while Denmark absorbed its own shock, the rest of Europe started copying the playbook. In November 2025, British Home Secretary Shabana Mahmood unveiled the biggest change to UK asylum policy in modern times, scrapping the Rwanda scheme, replacing permanent refugee status with temporary protection, openly modelled on Denmark. A Labour government citing Copenhagen by name. Sweden, Denmark's humane opposite through the 2010s, quietly switched sides. Asylum applications down 30% in 2025, down roughly 60% since the centre-right coalition took power in 2022, with ministers now describing their framework as Danish style. The Netherlands, Austria, Germany, Italy under Giorgia Meloni all now name-drop Denmark in policy speeches. Even the European Commission's own Home Affairs Directorate publishes studies treating Danish integration policy less as a problem and more as a case study. Underneath every law sits one idea Danish politicians keep returning to. A small, high-trust, generous welfare society cannot survive unlimited social fragmentation. Take away the shared something between neighbours, they argue, and the welfare state doesn't get voted away, it simply stops being paid for. Critics call that a polite mask for ethnic engineering and point at the demolitions, the veil ban, the non-Western threshold written into housing law. Supporters point at the asylum numbers, the falling costs, the stability, and the fact that most of Europe is now copying pieces of it. Both sides agree on one thing: Denmark is not backing down. It is doubling down. So here is the question we leave you with. Did a tiny Nordic country see Europe's future 10 years early and act while there was still time? Or did it just hand the West permission to dismantle the multicultural project 70 years in the making? Tell us below and subscribe to Fall of Nations. We'll see you in the next